Hello. Good afternoon. I would like to welcome everyone to this panel. My name is Indaya Bassani, and I am a professor at Unifesp, Universidade Federal de São Paulo, and I will be moderating this panel on behalf of the Abralin Morphology Committee. I shall start thanking Abralin and the committee coordinators, Professors Ana Paula Scher and Ieda Alves, for inviting and trusting me for this activity. And I also thank the other members of the committee for the support. As I said, this panel, Grammar, Architecture, Morphology, and its Interfaces, is one of the Abralin Ao Vivo activities, especially organized by the Morphology Committee. We are delighted with this panel and looking forward to the possibility of learning from such great linguists on these exciting and trending topics. Their works have been influential to language analysis and description all around the world. And we greatly appreciate their availability and kindness during our communication and preparation for this moment. I also thank the audience for being here with us on a Saturday, and I'll ask you to register your questions and comments in the chat during the lectures. Well, this panel focuses on word structure and its interaction with phonology and syntax. Professor Eulàlia Bonet will reveal and illustrate 3 cases in which a given phonological configuration has an impact on morpheme realization and non-realization. Professor Hagit Borer investigates if and how acategorial roots serve as input to merge, focusing on the interaction between roots and merge in the context of argument structure and complex words. And finally, Professor David Embick discusses how roots enter syntactic structures and whether or not they have phrasal structure, proposing that certain objects, although built syntactically, are complex heads without internal phrasal structure. A paper by Anderson asks, where is morphology? Well, we are going to see here today that morphology is everywhere in the grammar, and that's especially interesting when looked at from the perspective of interfaces. Maybe morphology is itself an interface. So making a pun with Morant's paper, today we are not going to escape from morphology. Well, that said, we will start by thanking Professor Eulàlia Bonet from the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. Professor Bonet has been working on phonology, morphology, and its interfaces. She has published a great number of research papers and books on topics like syncretism, allomorphy, and the description of Spanish phonology, among others. And I highlight her 2015 edited book, Understanding Allomorphy. So Professor Eulàlia Bonet, thanks. You have up to 30 minutes to your talk. You can start your video and your microphone. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for the invitation. I will be sharing my screen. Let's see. Okay. Wait, share. Okay, so I hope you see my slides. So this is, yeah. So
yes.
This is on the phonology in phonology, morpheme realization and non-realization. So here I will give a very brief overview of 3 types of cases I have worked on with other colleagues of mine. These cases touch on issues that have been at the center of much debate concerning the interaction between morphology and phonology, and in a much more limited way, the interaction between phonology, morphology, and syntax. And the 3 topics, or as Indaya said, one is identity avoidance and selection of allomorphs, non-realization of morphemes and phonology, and the role of paradigms at the morphology-phonology interface. And all these, the analysis I will present are a sketch, or that will be sketched, are framed in optimality theory. With respect to the first one, identity avoidance. Well, we know that identity is often avoided in phonology and morphology, and maybe not so clearly in syntax. In morphology, there are like 3 main strategies to avoid identity. One is haplology, and haplology means the deletion of one morph or non-realization of one morph. non-realization of the other one or coalescence. And sometimes it's difficult to tell. The one I will focus on is suppletion, which is the use of one exponent that's different from the expected one for one of the morphemes involved. And another possible non-solution is ineffability. That's no possible output. There's also the possibility of having some expletive or a pathetic material. Okay. So with respect to suppletion, there are actually like two kinds of suppletion, right? One is allomorphy, the one I will be focusing on. And the other one I've used this term recycling, borrowing it from a paper by Longa, Lorenzo, and Rigau from 1996. And you have an example of that in one. From Dutch. So Dutch has a declarative complementizer, that, and another complementizer used in interrogative context, that is off. When in interrogative context, there would be a succession of two offs, so off meaning either and off meaning whether, then the off meaning whether is replaced by the other complementizer. So we're using something that's already there, not like in allomorphy. It can be assumed that the recycled morpheme contains a subset of the features of the morpheme used in non-identity contexts. It's some kind of default. I must say that I'm not aware of any study that has investigated this type of strategy in depth. So if you know of any, I would like to know. So going to allomorphy, I will illustrate this with an example from Spanish conjunctions. So for and, usually the form used is e, and e is only used to avoid identity. So we say inquieto y optimista, not inquieto e optimista, but optimista e inquieto, not optimista y inquieto, right, with identity. And the same happens with or. So it's O usually and U only in identity context. So I wrote a paper with João Mascaró in 2006 about this case, and we analyzed it with an optimality theory, resorting to the notion of multiple inputs. This is a notion that has been proposed for optimizing phonologically conditioned allomorph selection. And in 3, you have an example of a very typical one. Everybody uses that one from Moroccan Arabic that uses, for the third singular masculine enclitic, uses U after consonant, H after vowel. And the idea is that the choice is driven by syllabification. So you choose the one that allows you to get better syllabification. And if we were to give the vocabulary item in distributed morphology terms, we would have something like in 4, right? Where the features corresponding to person singular masculine are spelled out, realized as a set of two items, two morphs. And for the Spanish conjunctions, we need something else, because we need to say that there's a preference relation between the allomorphs, right? Because one is the usual one, and the other one is used only when there's an identity problem. So we use this thing, I don't know what it's called, this preference relation that would appear in the lexical entry in 5, the VI. And then there's a constraint called priority that penalizes the selection of the less preferred allomorph. So when there's a conflict, and that's the OCP constraint, OCP against identity, right? Then we use the less preferred allomorph. Well, if there's no problem, we use the preferred one. So under this view, at least most cases of phonologically conditioned allomorphy with a preference relation, like this Spanish case, or without it, as in the Moroccan Arabic example, can be accounted for with VIs that contain a set of exponents. So what is sent to the phonology is a set. The morphology does not have access to the content of that set. It doesn't look inside. Okay, so that's one of the cases. The other one is something I worked on with Maria Rosa Lloret and Joan Mascaró in a paper that appeared in 2015, but we started writing it in 2006, I think. And we examined several cases from Spanish and Catalan in which within the DP, there's a concord asymmetry between material to the left of the noun and material to its right. And in 7, you have an example from Varieties of Spanish where arma triggers feminine agreement to its right, masculine agreement to its left. El nuevo arma secreta. That's for certain Spanish varieties. So that's one of the cases we treated. Another one, and that's the one I wanted to focus on here, because because of the interaction with phonology, is from northeastern central Catalan, NEC Catalan for short, where plural concord to the left of the noun fails only if it avoids a phonological sequence of a consonant S, plural S, and consonant. So when the plural S is trapped between consonants, and that only happens before the noun, not after the noun. So you have an example in 8, molt poc professionals, bons presents, professionals, the noun. And if we were to pronounce all the S's, they would all be trapped between consonants except for the last one. And so they don't realize the first two, molt poc, but professionals, bons, present, no problem. In 9a, there are a couple more examples. So a priori, one would say it looks like the syntax is having access to phonological information, but that's not what we say. So our analysis in a very sketchy way is the following. So we assumed that, and that's what you have in 10, that in the syntax, the noun triggers concord only to what is on its right, what's under what it commands or whatever, okay, the one to its right. And it has nothing to say about concord above it, right? At PF, there's a family of concord constraints that try to ensure that all elements within the DP share the same inflectional features with the noun, right? So everything has to agree with the noun. And it's something like an across the board thing. And then there's a max constraint that penalizes any inflectional features that are in the input and don't appear in the output. So that's going to ensure, or try to ensure, that the plural feature on the noun and on post-nominal adjectives stays as it is, as it was given by the syntax. So, and in 12, you have a very, very simplified tableau, very simplified. And so the idea is, so in the input, we have the noun taps with plural, and the belge and cars, that those are the post-nominal adjectives. They all have also been assigned plural, but not the prenominal one, the determiner, un. The candidates that you have here, one has full concord, that's like standard Catalan, or my variety also, uns taps bells cars. The second one is, which is going to be the winner, has what the syntax gave us, basically. And the third one is the only one that obeys the phonological constraint against trapped consonants. And that's why it doesn't have any violation in the second constraint, which is the phonological constraint, okay? The max constraint prevents the plural the plural from being erased or whatever from the noun and the post-nominal adjectives, but the phonological constraint has the power, let's say, to prevent plural conquered on the prenominal material. This case shows sensitivity to phonological information because of these constraint against a trapped S. It shows sensitivity to morphological information because only the plural morph is subject to non-realization. So if we had an S that belongs to a root, for instance, that would never be deleted. It has to be the plural morph. And to syntactic information because of the asymmetry in Concord between prenominal and postnominal modifiers. Under the view outlined here, syntax does not have access to phonological information at all, but the phonological component has access to morphosyntactic information and contains morphosyntactic constraints. I'm aware that there are other patterns of what has been called lazy concord in the nominal domain, with sometimes plural appearing only on the determiner, sometimes on a prenominal adjective, for instance, right? And here I give a reference to a paper by Cirino and Espinal from 2019, who deal with all these type of cases. So now I'm going to the third one, which is on paradigms. So in approaches like distributed morphology, there's no morphological operation can refer to paradigmatic relations. And under this view, phenomena like syncretism are treated are the result of post-syntactic operations or depend on the feature content of vocabulary items. But paradigms do seem to interact with phonology in certain cases. And I will give you an example from Balearic varieties of Catalan dealing with verbal forms in enclisis. And that's on work I've been doing with Chico Torres Tamarit in several papers on different varieties. And the example I will give you is from Formentera, from the island of Formentera. So here, what we see is that in second singular imperatives ending in a consonant, and that's going to be most of conjugation 2 and 3 verbs, have this added material that we call extension and in some paper accretion when they have enclitics. So if we have, like in 13, conjugation 1 verb like canta, nothing happens. We add a clitic or 2 clitics, and well, nothing happens morphologically. There's stress displacement, and that will play a role later. So they say cantola, cantamola. But in 13b, you have verbs from the other 2 conjugations. And what we see is that in isolation, we have just the root, perd, prana, fagesh, bull. Fagesh has this additional increment. And when we add enclitics, then there's this added material that you have in red here. So aga, iga, iga. So brangola, perdola, fagigola, buligola. Yeah. When we look at this extra stuff and at the morphological composition of their morphological composition, well, in the case of this added it's clear it's just one morpheme, and depending on the analysis, it will be a thin vowel or a tense vowel. Okay, the g that appears in second conjugation, that could be analyzed as 1 or 2 morphemes, and at least the g part, it's what it's called a velar extension. They call it a morpheme. Anyway, that appears in certain, in first person present indicative and in subjunctive in some non-personal forms and in some verbs, whatever. But the iga part, that at least contains 2 morphemes. The e is the typical thin vowel of third conjugation, and the g or at least the G is this velar extension. So if we tried, it wouldn't make much sense, I think, to try an analysis based on allomorphy and saying that with the bare imperative, we have like a zero morph, allomorph, and the g, iga are other allomorphs, because as I just said, one of them is at least two morphemes. So it wouldn't make much sense. So what is our account? Well, we actually related the morphological facts to stress displacement. And that happens in all the Balearic varieties to different extents. So if we look at the form without inclusives in the first conjugation where nothing happens, we see that there's stress displacement, canta, cantala, cantamala, and what we get is a right-aligned morae trochee. Trochee. But when we look at the other forms, if we didn't have these extensions, then we wouldn't have a right-aligned morae trochee, so we would get tetla. But perdola, aprangola, fagigola, buligola, that's they have a perfect right-aligned trochee. So instead of resorting to plain epenthetic vowel to repair the structures, they resort to morphological structure. And it's morphological structure that is found in the paradigm. So if we look at the paradigms of the imperative, we see that all these forms that we saw in perdola, we see it in the plural forms, perdão, perdão, aprengala, aprengam, aprengou, fagigola, fagigam, fagigo, etc. Yeah. So, and the essentials of the analysis, it's kind of complicated, but I tried to summarize it. So the idea is that the input contains the verbal form of the second person singular imperative without implicits. So, perd, lá, afegeix, lá, that kind of thing. And there's a highly ranked phonological constraint that penalizes any output without a right aligned morae trochee. And then we have several output constraints that compare listed output forms from the paradigm with the candidates, the different candidates, and evaluate them. For the syntactic and morphological derivation, there is no need to posit two different structures, one for the imperative in isolation and other one for the imperative and inclusives. I mean, that's a very, very short summary. And I think, okay, so here are the references. We can talk about these things later. The references and obrigada. Thanks.
Obrigada, Eulàlia. Thanks. Now we are, okay. We are going to have all the questions at the end after the talks, right? And
the microphone.
It's a classic. Now let's, we deeply thanks Professor Hagit Borer from Queen Mary University of London. Professor Borer's research focuses on comparative syntax, morphosyntax, and language acquisition. And recently she's been proposing a particular constructionist theoretical approach to word formation and argument structure. And also we have to highlight her very influential book series, Structuring Sense, on the syntax and semantics interface. So thanks, Professor. Thanks, Hagit. You have 30 minutes or more to present as you wish. Thank you. Your mic is muted as well.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. It doesn't feel so recent to me. It's been a while. And I don't have that as much time as I maybe would have liked. And so I will tell you upfront what it is that I will focus on. And that is, I will focus on the internal structure of the Semitic verb and what it can tell us about the word internal architecture of the root and what we can learn, what message we can take from this to our theory of what roots are all about. But what I wanted to start with is a little bit of an overview of where we stand. And some of it you can read on your own. And so there are matters, I mean, it's been 25 some years, David, you can correct me if it's been more or less, that we've been attempting to incorporate complex words into the syntax through a notion that there is such a unit as we call root. And largely agreed upon among people who adopt this approach the things that are listed in the middle of this page, and that is that roots are morphologically atomic, though what it means to be atomic is not always agreed on, and that they are acategorial, that roots have contextual allomorphs, that roots select or maybe are selected by allomorphic exponents of functional and categorial vocabulary, and that phonological realization is late. That's an impressive set of things to agree on, but the set of things that we do not agree on is actually quite striking. I think David will perhaps address some of them. So do roots actually have content, where by content I mean some kind of lexical meaning? That's not agreed on. There are various approaches around and there's no agreement there. It goes all the way from yes, absolutely, let's say, on the part of people like Malka Rappaport-Chovav recently, to people like me who say absolutely no, and then some variants in the middle. Are roots phonologically restricted? Yes, according to some, no, according to others. Do roots have complements? I imagine, again, David talk about that a great deal. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, not agreed on. Interaction between content and syntax, that's kind of the classical lexicalist agenda, and that is that the syntax of verbs is determined by their content. So is it, can we replicate it within the domain of the root? Well, for instance, according to especially Malka Rappaport-Chovav and various other people, yes, you can correlate the syntax of that emerges in the context of the root with some aspects of its meaning, more or less specified. Sometimes no. So I don't happen to think that root has content, but and I don't think it has syntax. But let's say Harley thinks that roots have syntax, which is divorced from whether or not they have meaning. And finally, there are issues of architecture, and I will spend mostly time talking about these. So do English affixes select other affixes? So for instance, could we say that the affix "eyes" selects the affix "Asian"? Could we say that the affix "abo" selects the affix "iti"? Could we say that the affix "ist" selects the affix "ik"? All these cases where we have a third tier affix. And so that's a question. The second question, which I think is an important one, I will address both of these, is if you take a C functor, by which I mean some kind of a piece of derivational morphology that has category specification on it, and if that piece of morphology is specified to merge with another category. So let's take Asian, for instance. When Asian merges with things, the category of which is obvious, such as, let's say, verbalize, we can see that it merges with verbs, but it wouldn't merge with adjectives. Okay. So the question is, if you take a functor like Asian, which when it merges with categorized things merges with a verb, can it also merge with just with the root, and with the root remaining perpetually uncategorized? That's actually been an extremely important strand in distributed morphology. But for instance, I have suggested that this is not a possibility because roots are automatically categorized by their context, and that remains an open question to my mind.
Professor, excuse me. People are asking you to zoom your screen a little bit.
Okay.
If you can make it a bit larger.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No problem.
Is that better? I think that might be the biggest I can. Well, maybe.
Yes, that's better.
Is this better? I can probably maybe.
Oh, I think it's okay now.
Bigger than this. No, that doesn't fit. No, I'm sorry. Okay.
No, that was good.
Okay. Okay. Okay, there are reasons, I think, to think that looking just at English is a little bit limited. And that is because in English, which remains pretty much the bench for root-based investigations, the architecture of root-based investigations, just about all monomorphemic roots are coextensive with roots. And that makes a lot of the answers not obvious. So for instance, if a form such as form takes a direct complement or direct argument or something like this, whether this is an argument of the verb or an argument of the root is, I mean, you can argue about this, but it's not an obvious thing, okay? And so in order to show that any particular thing is really a root and not, let's say, a verb or a noun or anything like this, then it is it would be prudent to show, for instance, that the grammatical properties that we are looking at specifically do not extend to non-root contexts. So something I will probably skip for reasons of time. If you have properties that are associated with derived verbs and with roots that are coextensive with verbs, then you want to ask whether the properties are really the properties of the verb or the properties of the root. Internal to any grammatical system, it would be prudent to consider specifically root-related properties which are held constant across all occurrences of the root. Malka Rappaport Hovav made this point relatively recently about content, which I actually don't think is correct, but the point has also been made very, very extensively, I think beginning with Aronoff, but also, let's say, more recently by Heidi Harley, that we can identify a piece of pronunciation, if you wish, as belonging to a common root, just simply based on the fact that it displays consistent phonological properties. So if you look at this paradigm in 1 and 2, which is in 1, which is an extremely well-known paradigm, we know that for a whole bunch of, as I said, pieces of sound in English, that they alternate between 2 pronunciations, and that alternation is completely predictable relative to its environment. And it occurs across the board regardless of what the prefix is in particular, but it is sensitive, let's say, to what the suffix is. And that has been the grounds, for instance, for Aronoff 1976 to make a move that at the time was extremely controversial, and that is to say that there are things that we can call roots, which are not really morphemes in the sense that they don't correlate sound and meaning. They're just pieces of sound. And I think that everything I'm going to say in some sense is an extension of that idea, because I think that idea was very much on the right track. Okay. Let's talk about, okay, I will skip this part. I will take it for granted that David will talk about this. And the bottom line of what I want to say here, just to give you a general idea, is that if I look at systems that attribute a complement to the root, primarily, let's say, Harley's system, what I need to wonder about is what kind of configuration and the syntax is going to give me the internal argument of something like sexualize. something will give me that argument. Sexualize is entirely compositional. I couldn't say that Sexualize has been reanalyzed as some kind of an atomic unit. It's Sexualize or sensualize, they're very transparent. So the al sits on a noun and gives us some kind of a predicative sort of situation where the properties of sex could be attributed to some argument. And what the eyes does is it impacts that particular argument. It makes somebody have that kind of property. The arguments have completely predictable roles. There's absolutely nothing listed here. And it's also entirely obvious that whatever arguments go with sensualize, they have nothing to do with sense, or with sexualize, they have nothing to do with sex. And so that's just a prima facie reason to believe that that's not the right way to go. And I also have a very brief, maybe slightly funny comment to make about allosems. Words have lots of allosems. That gives you the allosems, I think, of pinch. It's true that these are just quote unquote synonyms, but every one of these synonyms is in a principle an allosem. And if you think that pinch is unusual, I looked at things that are considerably more concrete. That's floor and right, and even derived forms like electricity. I encourage you to look up really complex things like verbalization. They all have lots and lots of allosems. And so just the bottom line here really is that substantive words have lots of meanings. And yes, we do know all these meanings, and that knowledge resides somewhere. So that's not a question that I'm denying the fact that we have this knowledge. We obviously do. The question is whether we really want it in the grammar, and does it ever have the meaning force of quantifiers or determiners? Do any or all of these allosems really have any computational force to speak of? And do we really stand a chance of being able to select the right allosem, not allomorph, the right allosem on the basis of a well-defined local syntactic context, as opposed to who knows what, okay, in life. Okay, so that's just a sort of, as I said, a reductio ad absurdum. And let me just move on now to what I really want to focus on, and that is the morphological properties of the Semitic root. The Semitic root is particularly a good thing to look at. First of all, the distinction between the root and a categorized constituent within the word is very clear-cut. It's not ambiguous at all. There is very clear morphophonological distinction between I'm sorry, this paragraph doesn't make any sense. Okay, forget it. There's very clear morphological distinction between, okay, verbs that are coextensive with the roots and verbs that come with an overt categorical component. This is something I will get to. The system is very heavily derivational. It's in some sense much more derivational than, let's say, a language like English. People don't usually think about it this way, but it is. Because pretty much any Semitic verb, not quite, but any Semitic verb is complex, is derivational. And that's not true in English. And not only that, the derivation is very systematic in a way that that we don't typically find in Indo-European languages for a variety of reasons. We don't find in the European languages for a variety of reasons. Okay. Okay, and finally, there's a non-trivial selection relationship that holds both relative to roots and relative to categorizers that make it very easy for us to see where the division of labor is. Okay. I think that studying the Semitic root, as I think constructivists have suspected all along, gives very, very strong evidence for root-based syntactic approaches to word formation. But it also provides more, let's say, nuanced answers to some of the questions that I posed that have specifically to do with the architecture of the word internal structure. The specific conclusions that I will reach is that the Semitic root has no content. That's been argued before. That the Semitic root has no syntax. That's not that surprising. But the more surprising maybe claims are that it definitely has a phonology and that in fact it's first and foremost a unit of sound. Whether it has any other role, I don't think so, but it certainly has been suggested otherwise at times. Okay. There are slightly more nuanced conclusions yet, and that is it is possible to merge both with an uncategorized root and with a categorized constituent. So when I claimed in 2013 that you can never effectively have a structure in which you merge with a root and the root is not automatically categorized, I think I was wrong. What there doesn't seem to be is ambiguous situations. You either merge with a root or you merge with a category. You don't merge with both. And finally, affix selection is possible in at least some cases. So let me go a little bit through what is going on in Semitic. I think things are maybe somewhat familiar, at least more familiar than they used to be. The Semitic root is a string of radicals, 2 to 4, which is in itself devoid of category and is not a possible phonological word. It needs to have additional vocalic information, and the vocalic information comes with additional syntactic factors, such as, let's say, tense. Okay. The Semitic keys, which is the term that I would use for templates of binyanim, think key signature. I just think about this musically is very attractive. So Semitic keys clearly do have a category, and thus they're clearly not roots. Okay, but they occupy some kind of an intermediate role between things that are roots and things that are maybe more classical derivational affixes. Keys, as well as nominal templates, are alternative phonological instantiations of C functors, specifically their V or little v exponents. And similarly, nominal and adjectival templates are N or A exponents, respectively. And this is in line with 1,300-year-old tradition, but is not always assumed. So for instance, both Doe in 2003 and Kastner 2016 proposed that these are actually not derivational categorizing pieces of morphology, but pieces of functional structure. Okay, the root selects a key, potentially more than one. There's a one-to-many situation here. There's no default. So you couldn't say that any particular root by default will choose something unless you give it more information, because the data just simply doesn't support it. The key selects the vocalization exponent within the functional spine to give rise to fixed perfective and imperfective stems. And that's deterministic. There's no default. Okay, so given a particular key, the particular vocalization it will choose for the perfective and the imperfective is fixed. If there are any variations, the variations are phonological. They're phonologically triggered. They're usually brought about by root radicals that are glides or possibly to begin with vowels, which is a possibility that must be considered. Keys select C components, which is to say additional derivational affixes such as noun and adjective, derived nominals and participles and adjectives. And that's also deterministic, and there's no default, so it's one-to-one. This little wiggly thing gives you a selection relationship. The root selects a key. As I said, it's one-to-many. You can select more than one. The key selects the functional exponents, and the key selects the C exponents. They're not selected by the root. Of course, by locality, the root couldn't select them, but it's still interesting that there's no default. So each key will select a different set of exponents. It's interesting to briefly pause and compare with English. So in English as well, the root can select C functor exponents, potentially more than one. And so you get both liquefy and liquidize, you get transmission, transmittance, transmittal, and so on. So the root in English also can select a C functor that is potentially more than one. That's not true within, let's say, the tense domain or the inflection domain, but it is true within the derivational domain. In English, C functors do not select inflectional exponents. So for instance, if the verb is eyes or efi, the inflection will just revert to default. And so it's really only the root in English that can influence, let's say, the realization of tense, but the verbalizers, overt verbalizers, do not do that. Whether or not C functors do or do not select other C exponents, well, that's, I already mentioned, that's an open debate. Some people think that they do. For instance, David here present, I believe, suggested to me that, which I think Plag also suggested, that Asian is selected by eyes and by efi. But I had proposed in 2013, and I still believe this to be the case, and that is the third tier, most third tier affixes in English are default. So it is the case that all suffixed verbs in English, Latinate suffix verbs, can only be nominalized with Asian, that all derived nominals, if you want to make them an adjective, the only one available is Al, eyes, and so on. It's a very limited choice. Once you go up, it becomes a very limited choice, and there's little evidence for an affix-specific choice. In 11, you have what it looks like. The particular notation is explained in the red. I gave you both Hebrew and Arabic, even though I will not really be speaking about Arabic, because Arabic is more than twice as rich as the Hebrew in terms of the key signatures. And so in Hebrew, you have basically 4 key signatures. In Arabic, you have 9. In Arabic, you have 9, and they all they are built basically from 2 components. Sometimes you have some prefixes, and sometimes you have the doubling of one of the radicals. Sometimes you have a vowel being specifically, a long vowel being specifically introduced as part of the template. The quality of the vowel is determined by other factors, but the fact that there will be a long vowel there is determined by the template. And in the next page, what you have is the variety of derived nominals that you get. And as I said, these are, what you get in the next page is what we get once we put these 2 things together. So if you look, for instance, at the Hebrew, you have a situation where I took the root with its 3 radicals in this case, and I put it together with the key signature. And what I get at the end is a unit. The unit consists of a prefix, if there is one, doubled radicals, if there are some, a long vowel, if there is some, and so on and so forth. This is, I will borrow from the work of Goldenberg and call these things the augmented root. I will call this the augmented root, even though it is categorized, it's already a verb. But, and the augmented root is possibly the closest thing in Semitic to a lexeme, if the notion is useful at all. And as such, it is very different from the root. It has a category, and roots do not have a category. It has stable, unique content, which is preserved throughout the functional domain. And it has a fixed phonology. But it is still not a phonological word. And this is very important because it's a bias that comes into Semitic from the study of other languages, that you cannot consider the Semitic, any Semitic intermediate forms. You can consider the root and you can consider the output. But in fact, it has been argued, and has been argued in important philological contributions, that there is an intermediate unit and that there are important prosodic properties that are defined on that intermediate unit. And most certainly, this is the one thing that all the further extensions of, let's say, the verb will have in common. Okay. You have some illustration of this selection in 12, and that gives you sort of an idea of just what it looks like. And in 4.1.1, just a bit of a comment about the existence of allomorphy. There is, strictly speaking, there is no root allomorphy in the context of a key. But there are variations, and specifically there are some roots that, by virtue of having one radical that is a glide usually, or perhaps a vowel, select a particular realization. Whether this is really an allomorph of the root, or even of, it is potentially an allomorph of the key that is selected in a particular context. But to say that it's an allomorph of the root doesn't seem right to me, because it's so systematic, and it's really just contingent on the existence of a glide. And I do believe that in a context of an appropriate vocalization representation, complete with properties of glides and and some prosodic constraints that hold under vocalization of the root, would account for this alternation, and fundamentally their rule govern, and hence they cannot be subsumed under idiosyncratic root selection. Okay. Okay, so that's part one of what happens in Semitic, and the part two of what happens in Semitic does not involve a key. That has to do with the very large body of the verbs that occur, let's say, in Arabic or in Hebrew. It's close to 40% of the verbs, and that's the binyan that's sometimes called the first template. I will call it kal because Hebrew has a special name for it, which means light. And I had put forth the idea that these do not involve a C functor. That these are cases of a direct merge of the root with the functional spine, and that categorization happens contextually. If people would like to put a silent little v there, be my guests, and then you have to put in, let's say, some notion about differences in selection that are impacted by the phonological content of little v, but it doesn't matter. What matters is it is a different thing. Whatever it is that verbalizes these roots, it does not create locality effects. And we get, in fact, we get exactly the picture that we get in English. We get that the root selects the vocalization exponents that give rise to the perfective, imperfective, and that we have a completely root-specific choice here. You know, the root selects it. Okay. Absent selection, there is a default. There is a very clear default, and that's what happens probably statistically in the majority of the cases, but not in all of them. The root selects a C component. It's root specific, it's one-to-many, you can have more than one, and absent selection, the C exponents revert to default. And so here in this case, we get what is basically the typical picture that we assume for English. And you have a few examples in 14. So 14 gives you root allomorphy, where you just get, for instance, for these particular two roots, give and take, you just lose the first consonant of the root in the imperfective stem, which doesn't happen with other roots that have initial consonant of the same kind. In terms of vocalization allomorphy, Hebrew has the combinations that you have in B. In Arabic, there are 3 possible vocalizations for the perfective, and there are 3 possible vocalizations for the imperfective. And of the 9 possible pairings that are possible, 7 are tested. And it's entirely specific to each root, which one it will come with. I mean, there is clearly a default. If you wanted the statistically more significant one to be the default, there is one that statistically overwhelms the others. What you have in C is derived nominals, and there is one that is derived nominals and the passive participle, and you have what is a default, and then you have everything else. In Arabic, Wright reports that there are, he lists them, so he lists 44 different deverbal nouns for the kal in classical Arabic, 44, okay? And plus he adds the following cautionary note, and that is all these nouns cannot, however, be formed from every triliteral verb. The majority of verbs admit of but one form very few of more than 2 or 3, of more than 2 and 3. What these are must be learned from the lexicon. And so he kind of more or less summarized my point. You have a very clear situation with lots and lots and lots of options and root selection. The comparison in English is that this is English, okay? There's nothing else to say. And so what we're taking away from this, or at least what I want to take away from this, is that there are 2 patterns here. There's one pattern of when you merge with a root, and there's one pattern of when you merge with something which is not a root. Both exist, and they have a different profile. And this is, in the case of Semitic, extremely clear, okay? It's also clear to me that the Semitic root has phonology, both in terms of its own realization and in terms of the impact on the realization of merging exponents. And I want to say a couple of things on root suppletion. There is one verb in Hebrew, which is the verb to tell, which, or if you wish, there are 2 verbs for tell in Hebrew, which seem to be in the process of paradigmatic merge. And you have the situation in 17. And so the 2 roots are, as you have them, ya, which is a glide, and gada, and the second one, which is mara. And the suppletive, the paradigmatic merge is not 100% complete, because the forms in green still exist in written Hebrew, but they have disappeared from the spoken language, and I expect eventually will also disappear from the written Hebrew. They're already quite rare in the written Hebrew. I did a Google search, and that's a lot of it is written. And so we have a situation where 2 roots, or so it seems, are in suppletion. However, if you look at this particular picture and you try to integrate it into how we view root suppletion, when we do have root suppletion that has been argued for, it doesn't really lend itself extremely easily to the sort of statements that we get. So if you look at 18, this is more or less, let's say, the Harley or Bobolik approach to how we characterize root suppletion. You have some root. For convenience sake, we can say it's the root that sometimes goes with go. And it is realized as when in the context of past and go otherwise, or root, some other root, arbitrary root, is realized as bet in the context of comparative, good otherwise. Okay, so this is more or less the suppletive statements that we get in English, and it seems easy to state. It's fairly intuitively stated. But let's look at the Hebrew case. This root, the first root, amara, occurs in a kal, which means it's a direct merger of the root with the functional functors. It's just the root together with whatever functional spine you have. The yagada is the key 5, and so it's not actually, doesn't actually merge directly with the functional structure. It merges first with some kind of a derivational exponent, and then after that with all these other future infinitive and imperfective and imperative and so on and so forth things. Okay. Each one of these roots in terms of its instantiations in the rest of the paradigm is entirely regular. It's entirely predictable. There's nothing unusual about any of it. For the kal derivation of this particular root, it's completely regular. For the yagad plus 5 derivation, pache, the fact that it has glidus, it's its first radical, it's entirely predictable. It would look like any other one, okay? But what is really in alternation here is not 2 roots. What is, I mean, you could say something like 19, that makes sense. You could say it's the same root, and that the root is realized as yagada in the context of the key 5 and amar elsewhere. And that's, I don't know if it's right, but at least it's easy to say. But what this is going to give you is just 2 full paradigms. I mean, paradigms informally. It's not going to give you the statement that one of these things is, that any of these things is conditioned or related or chooses a particular set of inflectional exponents. And so I've tried, so for instance, let's look at 20. The root is realized as amara in the context of past participles and derived nominals, and v otherwise. And perhaps that's a true statement, but that's not root suppletion. That creates, at best, it creates a suppletion between two augmented roots, or even worse, it creates a suppletion between a root and a syntacticalized categorial verb. And so this is extremely difficult to state. But in terms of what this looks like, it looks very much like root suppletion. Now, I don't particularly think root suppletion is a very attractive thing. There is perhaps no way to exclude it sometimes. But we can see here that at least when we look at a language where we have a distinction between derived forms and underived forms, that some statements that may appear very intuitively accurate in English are not really stateable. And at best, what we are getting here is we're getting a suppletion between two augmented roots, each one of which with its own separate paradigm, which is deficient. And if you want to, I mean, I can't really see my way around saying that these are two roots. I mean, I can't. Maybe somebody else has more imagination. Okay. C functors and selection. Do English affixes select other affixes? And these are the two questions that I asked. And does the merge environment for some C functors systematically ambiguous? So here are the answers from Semitic that I can see. Do Semitic affixes select other affixes? Yes, keys do. It's actually not evident that anything except keys ever do, but keys do. Keys select both C functors and S functors. And so as such, you can see that we have here a grammatical function, an affix that selects other affixes. What can we conclude from this for English? We can conclude for this from English that that's the same in English, or we can conclude, and I think that maybe is the more explanatory claim, that we are dealing with two systems. We have one system that has a default and one system that doesn't, for instance. For the key system, the notion of default is meaningless. For the root direct merger, the system was meaningful, but there was no affix selection. So Semitic keys operate outside the default system, which is appropriate for English. And each is associated with its own complete paradigm, functional realization array, derived nominal realization, derived adjective realization, and so on. In Hebrew, for instance, if that imperfective form is vocalized as a, you can predict what the derived nominal would look like, okay? And they're not derived from each other. They're not, because the derived nominal is not derived from the imperfective. It's just a very strong correlation. I mean, I don't want to say paradigm, which is what Aronoff had said, but the relationship, you're tracing back the vocalization to the key, and the key has very well-defined selection properties, and they're fixed. There's nothing like this in English. We don't have clustering of properties like this. We most certainly don't have any correlation between, let's say, irregular past and the selection of affixes, but that's perhaps because it's the Latinate, non-Latinate divide. But there's also, even within the derivational system, we have 8-if-ation which tend to come together, but that's about as strong as it is. They tend to come together, okay? If there are two distinct systems here, that would very much be supported by the fact that internal to Semitic, the two systems are actually in place. We do have the two systems. We can see very clearly how they behave differently. Okay. The second question is, do we have an ambiguous merge environments whereby we have some C functors that can merge with categories and that can merge with uncategorized roots at the same time? Well, keys merge with uncategorized roots, and so that's, for instance, would have to require for me to modify claims that I made in 2013. But it also appears that keys merge only with uncategorized roots. They don't merge with other categories. Okay. Other C functors merge with already categorized categories. And so we end up with a situation where we have keys standing somewhere halfway between roots and English derivational affixes. They do select, they do merge with things that are not categorized, but do we want to learn from this that this is that we do actually have ambiguous derivations where we have an affix such as Asian that can merge both with a root and with derived form. Let me just say, I will not talk about the syntax. I think that what I will have to say about the syntax of the Semitic root would follow directly from what I have to say about content. And what I have to say about content is just to illustrate what's been said before. And that is that the Semitic root has no content. Maya Arad very, very generously made available to me her corpus of roots. I'm not 100% sure it's all the roots there are, but it's, I think, all the roots in a conservative dictionary. And what I did is I did a relatively limited comparison of roots that occur both in key 3 and key 5. And the reason that I chose these two particular keys is because I am personally not aware of anybody who's ever said that there are derivational relationship between these two. Because there are some other keys which arguably can be derived from one another, but this is not the case. Okay, 3 and 5, they have a very different morphophonological signature, and they are not derivationally related by anybody's account, except for the fact that they may share a root. Okay, I didn't find that many. I mean, there's several thousand roots in that particular corpus. I found 118 verb pairs. That is, I found 118 cases in which the same root occurred in both of these forms. 60% of them had veritably different content. I gave you some examples. I mean, sometimes you can kind of see a metaphorical root. Maybe there was sometime a historical root. Sometime I can't see any connection at all. So the verb for sink and the verbs for invest have the same root. One is in 3 and one is in 5. And I mean, this is a case where you can maybe see a metaphorical connection, especially if you have a particular view of investments. When you look at shilem, which is to pay, and hishlim, which means to make peace, that's a little bit less direct. To placate and to lecture have the same root. That's not what I think I do when I lecture, but maybe some people do. Divide and sail, receive and parallel, these are not related. That's 60% of the cases. Okay. In 47 verb pairs, which is about 40%, did exhibit content relatedness. A very, very large, significant number of them are actually synonyms. Okay, so look at examples. If you look at pacify and pacified, it's the same meaning. It occurs in both 3 and 5. Explode and bomb, it's not exact synonyms, close enough. Sometimes it's got some kind of argument relation, connection, though, that, as I said, the relationship is not derivational, so excite and feel and so on. Now, I want to say that 40% is a lot. If in 40% of the cases, root meaning stays stable across keys, that's not a coincidence, okay? So that means that root meaning is not random. It does give us some indication of meaning, but by the same token, it couldn't be grammatical, okay? It's somewhere. I don't necessarily know how to model it. It has to be modeled somehow. And it's very clear that root meaning is at 40%. It's not a majority, but it's a huge bulge in this other random field of idiosyncratic meanings. But how to represent it is not obvious. except it's obvious to me that I don't want things that are at 40% in my computational system. So that's about all I can say about root meaning. And I think given all these meanings, it should come as very little surprise that roots cannot possibly be conceived to have an argument, because what that argument would be is going to be all over the place, which is just the illustration that you further have. So this is my conclusion at the end. The Semitic root is first and foremost a unit of sound, okay? I do have some thoughts. People can maybe ask me why I think that should be. Why should there be anything in the syntactic tree, which is just a piece of meaning, just a piece of sound? It's nothing else. But what is clear to me is that unlike some notions of roots now in circulation, that the Semitic root is absolutely and totally not some version of an acategorial lexeme, because that's really what we see. And so if English roots, as has been argued, and this is actually the null hypotheses, are fully or partially lexemes, then we are looking at a very different notion of what roots are, with the obvious theoretical consequences for modeling roots in complex words. Thank you all very much. I hope this was not too much. Okay. Okay.
Thanks, Hagit. That was great. It wasn't too much. It was really great. And now I will announce we are also very grateful to our last speaker, Professor David Embick from the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Embick's research focuses on the syntax, morphology, and phonology interaction. And he's one of the most important exponents of the distributed morphology theory, with a number of papers and books published. And more recently, he's been also researching on experimental morphology. And I highlight his 2010 Localism versus Globalism in Morphology and Phonology book, and his 2014 book entitled The Morpheme. So thanks, Professor Dave. You have up to 10 minutes or a bit more if you like. Thanks for being here.
Okay, thank you. And as the last speaker, I'd like to thank the organizers for assembling this wonderful panel. I'm going to share my screen. So I have here an old school handout for you. I hope it is visible. You can let me know.
Yes.
My point of departure here is a set of questions that are in the part of my work that relates a lot to what Hagit just framed for us, so that's quite useful. I'm going to talk about it in terms of two general themes, and then in the way that I like to do these things, I'm going to look at a very specific case study that I think illustrates an argument for doing one thing and not another thing that could have been possible. Okay, so my themes are first, how roots get into syntactic structures, and in particular, whether they are introduced in a way that involves phrasal structure. So for example, if we have Mary flattened the metal, we could ask whether there is phrasal structure there with flat that is along the lines of what you find with Mary hammered the metal flat, where it's clearly phrasal. There's a related theme that's going to surface throughout this discussion, which is kind of the wedge that gets me into the empirical argument that I want to make, which it has to do with in the universe where we're building objects syntactically, i.e. we have a syntactic approach to morphology, we nevertheless find that certain types of modification or semantic interactions look like they care about the word phrase boundary. So for example, in terms that I'm going to talk about later on today, something like this door is not opened is not equivalent to this door is unopened. And so on the face of it, what you have to ask is, what does that tell us if all derivation is supposed to be syntactic? My line of reasoning is going to take something with two and connect it with one throughout the paper that I'll present. And it's going to look like this. So first, I'm going to talk to you about what it might mean to build things that are small, that is multi-morphemic, but not phrasal. All right. And I'll show you that this does a number of useful things relative to some alternatives. I'm then going to look at stative passives, which I've been thinking about since I don't know when, also called adjectival passives and such, so like the recently opened door. They have some properties that I'll show you that make you might want to think that this kind of direct attach or non-phrasal approach looks good. But they are apparently able to scope over things that are phrasal. I made this argument myself. So you can say things like the metal is hammered flatter than a pancake. That looks like you want state of passive scoping over something phrasal. To get into the exciting part of this, I will consider these facts about state of passives in connection with unprefixation and show that the kind of phrasal structure that I've advocated in the past, in fact, leads to a scope paradox that is just unsolvable with the phrasal treatment, and that a smaller, meaning non-phrasal analysis will fix that and explain, or at least have the possibility to explain certain properties of modifiers and argument licensing that are otherwise not explained by current approaches to this kind of passive. Okay, launching point, smaller structures. This relates directly to some of Hagit's themes, so I'll go through it quickly. There's an idea that is being talked about in different forms that roots can be introduced in a way that does not involve phrasal projection. There's a couple of different intuitions you could connect to that. One is that you don't find roots interacting with modifiers in a way that suggests that they might be phrasal. Another, which is just kind of an intuition that again connects very closely with the way that Hagit has been approaching stuff for the last however many years that she mentioned before, 25 or so. Yeah, is that we're sort of getting a lot of scenarios in which roots are interpreted as properties of eventualities when we're thinking about verbs and adjectives, and the event structural properties that you care about and that relate to the arguments are part of the functional structure. And so from that point of view, they sort of adorn argument or event structure, but don't project it directly, okay? That's an intuition that you can associate with this hypothesis up here. There's a couple different versions of this that are stronger and weaker. One would just say you have to stick roots onto functional heads. Another would say that roots can only be attached to category definers. A third is what Hagit was talking about, where you could say they're inserted and then contextually categorized. This isn't going to matter too much for what I'm doing today, but it matters if you want to try and give an analysis of things like permission, because one theory will allow you to say only that mit gets together with shun first, and the other will allow you to say it gets together with per first. And this is kind of interesting downstream. It's a place where I agree with the last comment of Hagit's, which is whatever roots are in this theory, they are not lexemes. And you don't actually want a notion of lexeme in this approach, but we can talk about that if you want in the discussion. Either scenario, roots don't have a phrasal structure. So I'm going to move on. And I guess, the easiest illustration for the initial thing is that whereas before you would have seen structures in my work and other people's work that would have like kick taking a phrasal complement here and projecting a phrase, I'm replacing that with for, where I'm saying you directly head attach kick, let's say, to the V, and then that thing meets the complement. In my own work, that kind of direct merge operation shows up in a discussion of these state of passives, because I was sort of pointing out, if you want to derive something like hammer flat in this approach, where you have a complex predicate analysis of complex causatives or resultatives, there's no phrasal place for hammer to come from if you assume binary branching. So I said, the complement of the verb is flat, and you are creating that verb by attaching hammer directly to it, okay? This idea shows up elsewhere, and I'll give you a few pointers to that, in a few pages. I don't have like a formal account right now of what I think that operation is, but I will tell you what properties such an account would have in case you're curious to know what I'm thinking about. The idea would be first that terminals like V and N count as heads, as do roots. If you direct attach a root to a head, you get an object that is still of type head. And you can do this more than once, right? So you might have a root, you create something out of it that is X head, and then you can make a Y head. This might be one analysis of things like itemization, or connecting again with some of Hagit's things, what something like formation might look like within this set of assumptions. One reading of formation anyway. The main part that I'm going to care about later in the talk is that if you take one of these heads and have it take a complement that is unambiguously phrasal, then the whole object that results will be phrasal. Okay, this is going to get important when we get to un later. here's an illustration where I think you can start seeing what kinds of explanations you can put together with this approach, which is, I spent a long time thinking about XN compounds where X is adjective or noun, because they get into the kinds of transparency, opacity issues that we were talking about a moment ago for Semitic roots, right? And for these, you might want to say that, in the system I just outlined, you have something like truck, you create a noun out of it. You have something like beer, you create a noun out of that. If you merge the second noun to the first, I gave you little subscripts to keep track because it matters which is merged to which. You get beer truck, and the default semantics would be something like truck to which beer pertains in some regard that is conventionalized. Okay, now what's interesting for my purposes is if you compare this with the phrasal derivation of the type that Harley works out, where beer starts as the complement, NP complement of a root phrase truck. She creates beer truck through a series of movements, and movement is fine, but I'm just pointing out here that all else equal, you should be able to strand nominal modifiers here. So you could produce something like beer truck Pilsner on the interpretation, truck for Pilsner beer. And that does not happen. So you would have to start saying, well, okay, you can't have phrasal modifiers on this noun phrase, right? And I would say, why not? You would owe an account of that sort of thing. In this account, there's no phrasal structure, so that will follow. If you're going to have a modifier of beer, you can, it just would have to be itself a compound. So you could have a dark beer truck for dark beer. The most developed system of this type that uses small objects is found in Jim Wood's work on Icelandic nominalizations. And so I recommend that if you're interested in seeing how this works out in a detailed case study, you could look at that. I'm also mentioning here some other types of nominals where I think it might apply. Okay. Stative passives, for those of us who are interested in argument event structure, they have a special place, although it's not clear that people always go back and read a lot of the literature on this, and including me, I guess, although I've done that more recently. If you think about these things, if you're saying the door is opened or the metal is flattened or the broken table or whatever, if you want to start thinking about the structure of these things, you would go, okay, it seems like I have a verb and I need to stativize it. So you would have something minimally like the object in 11 for basic cases. On the face of it, you need to start thinking about phrasal structure right away though, because you have things like in 12 here, where I can have something that is painted a lovely shade of lime green, a door opened wider than it should have been, and metal hammered flatter than a pancake. These are three different types of phrasal modifiers, and it looks like the stative passive is scoping over them, which means it looks like you would want to have these modifiers phrasally down here, and then stative passive taking a VP complement, okay? That was an argument that I made in my 2004 paper. So in that paper, for various reasons, I had all stative passives as phrasal. Kratzer 2001, from a different perspective, also is making a similar argument and has some stative passives as phrasal. Her argument is based on a type of adverbial modification. So she's looking at German and she has these examples like the hair was still sloppily combed, where this is a participle, and that's grammatical, but the hair was sloppily greasy, where that's an adjective, is ungrammatical. So she says, okay, what's going on here is that the stative passive is verbalized, it has a VP in it, and it allows an adverb, but the adjective doesn't have any sort of phrasal verbal structure, and therefore the adverb is ungrammatical. So on that approach, like on the one I outlined, you would say at least some stative passives are going to have a phrasal structure below them, phrasal VP. Okay. Here's the thing, that idea that these stative passives are phrasal gets taken up in many, many approaches following, the early 2000s period. And this connects with this point about the compounds I was making earlier. There's something sort of striking that is not addressed in a lot of this literature, which is that while some apparently phrasal material is allowed in stative passives, other things that are perfectly happy in verb phrases are not allowed. So here, like in 16, I can say things like, the Romans destroyed the city violently 2,035 years ago with fire arrows by launching boulders into it. those are just normal VP modifiers. They're all bad or deviant in the state of passive. So the city is destroyed violently, etc. This is just, they're bad, right? And that's not expected if you could just build a VP with any VP material and stativize it. So that really is something that is in need of an explanation. Along these lines, you can do the same thing in German, and I'll just tell you about it because it's German, not my focus today, but it illustrates a semantic point about coercion that is going to be important, which is if you say something like, you know, Hans's hair is combed with his mother's brush, that's this one here, that sounds extremely odd out of context. But if you know that that brush leaves a zigzag pattern or something like that, that is, it leaves a property on the state, then it becomes perfectly fine and people can get that to work. That's going to play a role in the later discussion. Okay, so looking ahead, we're going to see a general pattern coming up later, which is that the modifiers with stative passives that you get pertain to the state, not the event that produced that state. And so that's going to lead to an idea that you might actually be able to treat stative passives as small and have these modifiers come in after you've done all the stativization. Okay, transition to un. There's a whole lot of really interesting stuff going on with the morphemes that are pronounced as un. For my purposes, the most important is going to start with the observation that un attaches completely productively to stative passives. So in my examples here, I have a bunch of things that will sound either good or bad in the positive version. So these boxes remained flattened or opened all day. These are fine. But these boxes remained kicked, licked, watched, or examined all day. These are really deviant, okay? But you can put un on all of these, and when you do that, they all become fine. So the boxes remained unflattened all day, fine. The boxes remained unkicked all day, equally fine. So un has not only the property to attach to these stative passives, it provides at least enough context in some sense to allow them to be coerced when their lexical meaning otherwise does not like that interpretation. There's a lot you can do with that. For my goals today, I just want to observe that un scopes over the state of passive. So when you say that something is unverbed, you're saying that it's not in some state S, not that it is in a state of not having undergone a verb event. Okay, that's the scope part that's going to be relevant for us. Okay, so I went through this quickly because it's schematic, and I'd be happy to go over details if people would like to, but just the last two sections that I've gone through with you produce this interesting scope paradox that I'm going to spend the rest of the discussion talking about, which is, it looks like stative passive scopes over resultative secondary predicates. Why? Well, you can say something is hammered flatter than a pancake. It looks like un clearly scopes over stative passive. We just talked about that here. That's what you're doing by attaching un. So what you should get is un over stative passive over resultative secondary predicate. And you generate these examples and they're terribly ungrammatical. So the metal is unhammered flat is just, you know, completely horrible. So that's going to be a real problem for any approach that builds stative passives on top of phrasal VPs and then, you know, has unscoping over that. That just produces something that clearly should mean something like not in the state of having been hammered flat, but it doesn't. Okay, synthesis. This is going to be putting the previous sections together. Basically what I'm going to do is show you how this problem does not arise if you treat unstative passives as small in my sense. And then I will show you that treating all stative passives as small programmatically gives you a bunch of stuff about modifiers and argument asymmetries that you don't get on phrasal accounts. First, just data point is, it's not just the metal is unhammered flat that's ungrammatical. You also get the box is unpainted lime green and the door is unopened white. Those types of modifiers are also bad. To see what is going on here in light of my themes at the beginning of the handout, remember I kind of said, well, if you had a phrasal approach to roots, what you're committed to is the idea that something like Mary flattened the metal has flat in a phrasal syntax that you see in Mary hammered the metal flat. And now what I'm pointing out as a further point is, if that were the case, why is unflattened grammatical and unhammered flat ungrammatical. That just would make no sense if they were both phrasal in that way that I indicated at the outset. So this is going to lead me to talk about a small analysis. How small? Good question. First thing I'm going to assume here is that un scopes over the things that it C commands. You can see a discussion from a slightly different universe in Kane's paper about this, where the same assumption plays a role. If you had only in your data set that you were considering examples like the metal is unhammered, you could consider, having neg attached to a phrasal stative passive like this. But then, as I was pointing out with my words earlier, you would basically predict that you should get neg taking the stative passive complement with, a secondary predicate down here, and these things are ungrammatical. So there's clearly something wrong with 25. That's why it says does not work. So, you can generalize this point because there are a lot of different nuances to the analyses of the internal structures of these things. If you had this in the abstract, say like Bruning's paper does, then unhammered flat should mean something like not in the target state of a hammering that ends in flatness and be grammatical. It doesn't. And that kind of generalizes to any approach that has un as a head that takes stative passive as its phrasal complement and attaches these modifiers anywhere below that. Okay, so there's a bunch of different assumptions that one could make about the details, but any analysis that has these general properties is going to produce the scope paradox in my view. Okay. So my proposal, it has a star by it, because we're going to talk about this a little bit, is that the type of negation that is realized as un is directly head attached to the stative head. Okay, and I'm giving you here in 26 a verb that has maybe a prefix. So this could be like destroy or something like that if you want it to be. That will become relevant later on. And you can stativize this object. And in the universe that I introduced in the second section, this would still be, an object of type head. And then you would attach neg directly to this. And in the way that I outlined above, it would scope over this whole thing. And you would get the interpretations, unopened, unhammered, undestroyed, that sort of thing. There's a couple of notes that I have here that you can think about if you're interested in this sort of thing. You have to get into, if you do this, questions about what the substitution versus adjunction distinction looks like at the head level, and also what kinds of notions like C command might look like at that level. That's what these bullets here are for, in case you're looking at this handout later. Okay, what I care about mostly right now is what if there were phrasal material inside of a VP that is stativized? That would look something like 28, okay? If un only has the ability to attach to the stative head, then the only way you could create a stative passive out of this is by doing 29. And 29 doesn't work because, among other things, neg doesn't scope over what it's supposed to be deriving. So it's not going to produce in this structure the meaning not in a state of having been hammered flat. There are a couple ways you can talk about that. You could say things like, negated states cannot be target states, but you do not expect unhammered flat to be grammatical because of the position that neg has to be in relative to the rest of this VP over here. It's only scoping over this state part. If you tried to fix this by having hammer originate over here with the stative part, this is what the second bullet is indicating here, you would produce a meaning that is something like flat as a result of not being in a state of having undergone a hammering event, which is nonsensical, although you can get kind of subtle about this if you want to in the discussion period. But the summary point is that you don't actually get into the scope paradox on this approach because you're not creating these phrasal structures in which it arises, and you're predicting that things like unhammered are going to be grammatical, but things like unhammered flat, et cetera, will not be because of the position that neg has to assume within this object that I derived in 29. Okay, here's where it gets a little more speculative, but I think in a fun way. The question I'm asking myself with 2 stars is, could all stative passives be small? And the reason I want to do this is because it makes me rethink some of these motivations for phrasal structure in the first place. Because on the face of it, you go, well, no, because you just told us, in section 3 that the stative passive scopes over resultatives and such. Now I'm going to tell you that you can put that on hold, and that if you do treat all stative passives as small, you explain why you don't get all these modifiers that you do get in typical VPs automatically, with some exceptions that we can go over. I'm going to skip this section because I want to be able to stop with time for discussion. But you'll also be able to have a path towards explaining certain argument licensing asymmetries, which I think are just not addressed on most current accounts, but were kind of central to this domain when it was initially examined. So I'm going to scroll forward to that section. Okay, what kinds of generalizations about arguments? Well, it's sort of striking that in looking at verb phrases in English, like the car dealer sold the customers a car, eventive passives can be formed on both internal arguments, right? You can say a car was sold to the customers. You can also say the customers were sold a car. In stative passives, though, arguments start disappearing, and they disappear in a way that suggests that there's something systematic going on. So for example, from 35, you can talk about recently sold cars, but you cannot talk about recently sold customers on the relevant interpretation, where they're customers who have recently been sold the cars. Completely ungrammatical. There's nothing, inherently incompatible between those kinds of arguments and states, because you can say things like, when the customers are done being shown the houses, please take them to the office. So there's nothing like where you just go like, goals don't work in stativized things. They do. It's just in stative passives that some of these arguments start going away. This discussed a lot in this literature from the 70s to the 80s, where people were first talking about it in terms of a thematic restriction, like only patients and themes can stick around in stative passives. The consensus became that it was what people would call direct arguments. And I'll tell you about this in a few steps. First, it was observed that you can have verbs that do not behave like show in apparently having the goal around, but not the patient or theme. So if you have feed, you can have recently fed babies, the goal around, but recently fed carrot types is not good. And then there are other verbs like teach, for which both arguments stay around. So if I teach languages to some students, I can have recently taught languages or recently taught students. Okay. The systematicity of this is connected to the observation that the argument that can stick around is the one that can be present in a monotransitive version of these ditransitives. So you can say I sold the cars, but star I sold the customers, unless you're actually vending customers. You can say I fed the babies, but star I fed 2 carrot types. And you can have in a monotransitive, I taught 3 students, or I taught Hittite. Dowdy actually goes through this in an interesting way that allows you to understand what a lot of earlier approaches were doing. Okay, so try and get through this quickly so I can conclude. It's complex literature, but if you go back to what Levin and Rappaport say, it looks like they're saying stative passives are possible only with direct arguments. That means arguments that are really, really like given their thematic interpretation by the verb. In my version of this from 2004, that turns into something that looks like stative passives are possible only with arguments that are licensed by the root or don't require additional structure. That's what I was investigating at that time. Problem is that both of these things, I think, turn out to be incorrect, and that there's a third generalization at play here, which is illustrated in the following, where in 44 and 45, I'm going to give you stative passives where the argument in question does not appear to be an argument of the root at all. Okay, so this would be like, if you have Mary ran the soles of her shoes thin, you cannot say Mary ran the soles of her shoes, right? That's getting interpreted with reference to thin, and the running event brings this about. But you can say the soles of my shoes are run thin because I've been too busy lately. Ditto for pseudopassives or stative pseudopassives. You can say, nobody talked to John last night, and then poor John remained untalked to for the entire party. Okay, in that case, we wouldn't say that John is an argument of talk. John is clearly being introduced in a way that's associated with prepositional to. Okay, so these go in a couple different directions, but the question then that I state in 46 is, what accounts for which non-root arguments are possible in stative passives and which are not? And the answer I'm exploring is in bold-faced and italics, which is the arguments that are licensed in stative passives are all and only those that can be licensed in a small way, that is non-phrasally. And I'm just going to say that in the interests of allowing some time for discussion, but I'd be happy to elaborate on this if you would like details. But I'm going to go to my general conclusion, which is the program, is going to be to see how many different argument licensing, restrictions can come out of the small analysis. But just the discussion that occupies the first part of the handout, I think there's some interesting conclusions. The first is, countenancing smaller structures gives you one way of thinking about why an exclusively syntactic approach would lead to modification asymmetries that seem to care about big versus small. It's not word versus non-word necessarily, but it's big versus small. Stated passive is a great test case for this because you can reason carefully through about whether there's phrasal structure or not. And when you do this, you can produce this scope paradox with un. And then if you take it one step further, you can show that a small analysis of un and stated passives resolves the scope issue. That's an important thing. And then the last bullet, which is the more programmatic part, is that, there's something possibly counterintuitive about generalizing the small view. But if you do this, my claim is you're getting insight into modification restrictions that otherwise aren't addressed or explained, and ditto for argument licensing asymmetries. Overall, though, one clear implication of this argument is it gives you a specific case where you can reason through alternatives about phrasal versus non-phrasal licensing, and where I think you have a good piece of evidence that roots are not being introduced phrasally. Thanks, I'll stop with that.
Thanks, David. It was great too. So thanks for all of you for the awesome presentations and topics. And now I think we could use some time for you to direct questions at each other. And after that, I will check on the questions from the audience. What do you think? You know, if you have any questions.
Yeah, I think it's a bit hard without the handout. That's the problem. So because I think you mentioned that the Eulàlia's is available on the main site. I don't know where the David's is.
Yes, it is available.
Yours, but is David's also?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I got it.
Okay. You got it in the mail, or you got it on the
From
site?
the website. From the website.
So I guess maybe I'm not sure what the address is. Do you mind?
I'll just paste it here in the chat.
Okay, that would be great. Yeah, thanks.
Here in the chat.
Okay, that would be great. Yeah, okay. Actually, where? Because I think I was on the site before, but I didn't have the faintest idea how to negotiate. So where would the handouts be?
Over on the left in the yellow, it says the additional material.
Yes, click on their names.
Yes, I got it. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks.
Actually, where? Because I think I was on the site before, but I didn't have the faintest idea how to negotiate. Where would the handouts be?
Why is this bringing me back to me?
I don't know if you want.
Yeah,
I found it.
Yes, click on their names.
Yes, I got it.
I think that maybe someone is with the online transmission opened, and then we are listening to it back. I don't know, it's just me.
Why is this bringing me back to me? Yeah, I think somebody needs to.
I don't know if you want.
Maybe it's
I found it. Yeah. Okay, so maybe Hagit, you want some time to go over the handout to make the question? Then I can see if we have questions from the audience meanwhile. Yes, we have a question in here from Luis Carlos Chiuint, Professor Luis Carlos Chiuint, maybe. Professor Luis asks to Eulàlia, in your proposal of an OT type grammar distributed morphology, you are admitting levels in phonological derivation, such as McCarty and Wolff's harmonic serialism, plus realization of OT, or all is processed in parallel. So I will copy the questions in here.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I followed the question, but so the question is, how is all integrated, right? So whether you have this distributed morphology, type morphology, or
yeah,
and then
yeah, yes, I was thinking about something in line with it also. I was going to ask you to explain how constraints and under specification works. Yeah. If that's, yes, that's a mixture of the two theoretical models. I was very interested in that, how they interact. I think it might be related to Luis Carlos' question too.
Yeah. So okay. Okay. What I would say, but I don't know. So for up to exponents, I would assume a late insertion model and you know, vocabulary insertion more or less in the sort of more or less standard DM, with the exception that I think we should allow for multiple inputs and things like that without having to look at the inside, right? So like I gave this example, I don't know, like the Spanish one, right? So we can, that you send a set, and maybe within that set, you even have more elaborate type of information. So like, for instance, for prosodically conditioned allomorphy and cases like that. But I don't know, I haven't given it a thought, much of a thought, except for the, you know, the just plain multiple inputs and the preference type relations. But it's kind of tricky then when, like with the late insertion, how you send everything to the phonology, whether you do it by phases or by not phases. It's kind of tricky. So in most of my work, the input has already the exponents there, except for these cases where you have a choice. I've tried in some paper to do it like starting. So when you start the phonology, like with Matthew Wolff has done, that he starts, so the input to phonology is the abstract morphemes. They have, so no phonology in the input. And it does get kind of tricky. So, you know, you have to spell out roots and maybe like for Romance languages or like Spanish or Catalan, you have to already insert like the theme vowels or something together with the root. I mean, it's kind of complicated. And then with respect to the phonological side, I've tried to do it always in parallel, but I'm not sure it works completely. So I don't know. Okay. What I've done in parallel, but I'm not 100% about it. Not right. Harmonic serialism. So maybe in a straddle type.
Yeah,
that would be easier. I think it would be better. But yeah.
Okay, thanks, Professor. And we have another question from Janaína Carvalho to Hagit. And I have questions too, so I'll make their questions first. But maybe I can say two, and then Hagit, you can answer both of them or one of them. Just let me just see here. Janaína asks to Professor Hagit, should we always look for irregularity in order to affirm that a root was categorized contextually? So that's the question. I'm always copying here in the chat. And I was also intrigued by the notion of the keys and the fact that they don't have a default form. So I was wondering about acquisition. So is there a prediction that if keys do not have a default form, you're not going to have any over-regularization or error during the acquisition when kids are dealing with those keys? And if you could again say what are the keys very quickly. I think it was for me, it was a new notion and very interesting. Thanks. Your mic is off. Thanks.
I don't think irregularity is necessary. Perhaps it's sufficient, but I don't think it's necessary for establishing either contextual categorization or let's say, I don't know, zero head or something like that. It's just that we have a relatively limited arsenal of tests. I know that a person who works on highly inflectional language that is just inflection and North Pacific language asked me how would I tell whether they're roots, and she said there are no allomorphy, and I just couldn't find a test. So that might be just that I can't think of tests except being monomorphemic in some obvious sense, and that's also depending on how free your internal analysis is or isn't, is not conclusive. And so irregularity, we just know that this is, it's pretty firmly built into our notion that irregularity is local, that it's triggered locally, assuming we can agree what locality holds, and so on. And so that doesn't mean there aren't other tests. It just means that we have to develop them. Yeah, I don't know, perhaps other people have thoughts. Relative to the keys, children, it's interesting what mistakes children do make. First of all, children do use the wrong key sometimes, sometimes quite persistently, and with, I mean, it's it would be the right root, but not the right key. I think I did work on this at some point, and I established that this means that the retrieval, it's retrieval issues, and it has to do precisely with the fact that these are exponents and not really contributing factors to the meaning. And children make agreement errors in plural, for instance, where the picture is not like this. But I don't think there are inflectional errors of the sort that you're thinking of, except perhaps neutralizing some vocalic distinctions, which just may be the indicative of language change, because there's been relatively little work on how much modern Hebrew has changed in the 100 years that it's been spoken, and it's changed massively, and especially vowel quality, and so I think children may neutralize certain vocalic distinctions. But and there are definitely there are both cases of the wrong key, and there are also cases of invented keys that children have somehow across the board invented a key that doesn't actually quite exist. It's prosodically speaking, it's completely possible. It just isn't there. Okay. So yeah, as far as I know, it's kind of like what people say about Turkish. I mean, certain kinds of mistakes don't occur, others do. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So there is a question here to Dave. So Janaina is also asking for you to explain the grammaticality of a sentence like the boxes were made and kicked. Would we have to assume that negotiation has a different place of merge in sentences with resultant states? And my question was, when you say that on cannot be attached to hammered flat, some people will say that this is blocked somewhere else. This is not a syntax problem. I wanted to know if you thought about this kind of analysis to say, okay, it would be okay to form a hammered, it's flat, but it's a, I don't know, it's a problem of the word and not of the syntax.
It doesn't feel like a problem of the word or the world. I
agree, but some people would say.
Yeah, I mean, so there's some interesting further things about "un" that I think are a little bit harder to understand. One is people tend to say things like, there's no verbal compounding in English, or it's limited. That's false. There's actually a lot. It's just that there's this requirement that the first part of the compound should not be an argument of the verbal part. So like, I pan-sear fish, or I can ninja walk, or throat punch, an adversary, right? Pan-seared is really great as a stated passive. We would say like pan-seared tuna or something. But unpan-seared, which should have the meaning, just not pan-seared, does not work. Suggesting either that adverb type thing with pan-sear has phrasal structure, or there's something that we don't understand about that. I have that as a note in the handout as something that one could look into. Larry Horn tried to convince me that was something about the world, not something about the word. And I respect Larry's opinions, but I'm not sure I was convinced by that. He just said, well, you don't need to say unpan-seared. For the question in the chat about un, I think all these uns are being merged in the same place. There's kind of a slightly different use of un where you might be able to get it taking a phrase. It has a prosodic break. You could say that these are unhammered flat, and that's not the meaning or reading I'm talking about. But for the question about kicked, you have to go into the semantics and distinguish, between target states, like the state that you wound up in as the end of the event, and resultant states, meaning did you undergo an event of that type in some specified time period. And with kick, it's not that it, can't have those meanings as kicked. It's just that you have to give some context for coercion. Okay, so the one I give is like, it's called the tire factory, where we have to kick every tire before we go home. And then when I've done this, I can walk up to you and say, okay, the tires are kicked, let's go home. Another context for something that's more like target state is if you have someone who, has a powerful leg, you can say, oh, well, when Mary, kicks a ball, it stays kicked. Okay, that's a target state. So for each of those, it's showing you that you can get kick into target and resultant state interpretations. You just need context. And so I think what un is doing is giving you an easy access to a resultant state interpretation, right? What's relevant is they just have not undergone a kicking event in some time period, and un makes that really obvious. And that's why these things are easy to coerce. I see now another question has appeared, which I haven't read yet.
It was, I just saw she wrote another question just after the first. So I think it was just a compliment. Could you comment on the grammaticality?
There was a question to me, I think, Janina, but I think, Janina, it's very similar perhaps to the question that you asked before, and that is what tools do we have to actually identify roots? And yes. I mean, it's irregularity. I mean, allomorphy or whatever, any kind of root allomorphy is definitely up there. But it's also, you have to look at the language. I mean, the language may have a particular set of I mean, it's been argued, I think actually quite compellingly, and not necessarily something I would have wanted to believe in, that in some varieties of Chinese, you have root compounds. And so then you have a certain kind of identification for what a root is and whether it's categorized or not from that. There's also perhaps stress patterns or a variety of, it's extremely difficult for me to tell upfront what would be the situation in a particular language, but I do hope we are not just reduced to irregularities. That's just my hope, that we will have a positive test for what is a root that is not so completely dependent on either root allomorphy or on idiosyncratic exponent realization. Yeah, okay. Can I ask Dave a question?
Sure.
Okay, so I'm looking at your structures, and also because you mentioned Jim Wood's structures, and by Beer's phrase structure, there isn't really such a thing as a non-phrasal V, right? So if I look at your structures or his derived nominal structure, that little v is a v max, and hence it is actually a maximal instantiation of v. And so my question to you really is why you choose to place the thrust of what you want to say, that the smallness, relative to the nature of the v, as opposed to the existence of some functional structure that would be giving you things that would be outside the domain of the nominalization in his case, or the domain of your stative in other cases. And so the smallness would not be relative to the V constituent, which would be whatever V constituents do, especially if you don't assume that they actually have complements. And that would also open the door to a very large body of work that's out there that distinguishes exactly this kind of smallness from bigness. And that is where you do have the domain of the word formation be either, it's always V, but it's either, it could be placed in different places along the functional spine. Do you see what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are two parts to it. For the first part, on the constituent structure theory, people maybe don't talk about this that much, but if you have something like bare phrase structure and you have something like a substitution, adjunction, distinction, and part of the definition of adjunction is that it doesn't change the type of the target, then this operation could be you join a head to a head, and because that structure building operation is adjunction, the output is a head because you don't change type when you adjoin.
What do you mean? You mean you don't raise the you don't raise the quote unquote bar level?
Yeah. Yeah,
but I think okay. This is something I did actually look at, and perhaps you looked at cases which show which have a different result. But I think if you actually move complementation and argumentation outside of the domain of the maximal of the phrasal category, then you lose the problem.
Yeah, I think the second part of what you're asking, I think I'm interpreting it as something like, why don't you build phrasal VPs and then delimit them with some extra material and then say that the modification asymmetries come from that? And I think that's one take on it. I've thought about that. There are two reasons why I have not pursued that. The first is that it's not like some modifiers that are typically found with VPs are around and the rest aren't. It's like all the ones I could think of that should go in kind of garden variety VPs go away. So it looked like a larger scale effect.
Yeah, no, I know, but I mean, okay, I mean, let me actually go back maybe to your...
Could I just finish that? The second reason was that when the modifiers are possible, it's actually a kind of a version of what you're saying, but it's what I'm saying, which is the modifiers are possible when they pertain to the state. So it looks like they're attaching higher. So in other words, it's the state of Eisenhower that is delimiting this domain in a way that precludes it from being modified further. Now, I went over this quickly, but there are lots of ways of stativizing full VPs that do not make the modifiers go away. So these done constructions and perfects are both stative, but you get all the normal VP stuff down below. So I sort of took those two observations together and said, okay, so it doesn't look like we have any sort of VP properties. So let's follow the size approach rather than the delimitation. But like, I think you're getting at this in a different direction. I'm basically saying that there's a particular kind of stativization that does delimit things. But
I'm not doubting this. I'm taking your results as stated. I'm just wondering whether you want to because, for instance, when you said the type approach, I mean, this is the sort of the well-known issues of X-bar theory and unhappiness, you know, or whatever, or the paradoxes and so on. But or you know, how can you have a complementation and affixation at the same time? But the thing is there ever anything other than V min, V max? That would be the question. And if that's the question, and everything else is a specifier of some functional structure, then that type problem that you mentioned disappears, and also the other thing that you mentioned. So the question is really where you put your stative head in the structure, on what's below it and what's above it.
Yeah, there's that, and there's also some question about where the argument is introduced that is relevant to that. Like,
no, right, but I mean it would become interesting if there are paradoxes.
Yeah, I think I'm going to answer a slightly different question, but it connects with a point that you were making, which is that most of the objects that I'm looking at are, like you're saying, they're either complex heads or they're phrasal VPs. So, like, for example, I gave the case where John remained untalked to, right? There are these cases in English where you get the argument introduced by a prefix and they function similarly. So you moan, but you can bemoan a loss or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. Those objects in English are clearly small. There's an ambiguous case, which is what you do with these particle type things, where I'm not sure how the judgments go. If you have like bigger things like out or up, that I have to look into. But I think related to some of the points that you were making about lexemes and things like that, if you look at the way that these prefixes and particles work in, say, German and Dutch, right? You have the types that are inseparable, like fair in German, whatever. You have the separable type that are clearly syntactically in a different phrase, right? They're stranded by V2. But both of them can condition opacity of the root and give you a special meaning, right? Which is just showing that any sort of word-based notion of the lexeme, it's just on the wrong track, because if that were on the right track, you would have a clear, right? And so what I think for English, it's harder to get something that clean because of just the judgments I've had with things like, unthrown out. Mm-hmm. Is that good? I think probably, I kind of was hedging about this. People tell me they're good, but that's a case that's kind of interesting there, I think, from that point of view.
Okay.
Can I ask, I have a question, comment for Eulàlia that connects with some things that Hagit was talking about as well. And the
Sure.
first question is that,
sure.
So I think, the first question was kind of about how big are the things you're working on when you do your vocabulary insertion with optimization. And I think, like you were suggesting, they can be relatively small, and in that case, it's not a huge difference between doing things with just ordering and doing things with ordering of VIs plus OT to, solve some certain types of competition. And so my question was, in my head, that means that a lot of things have moved beyond this OT versus derivational approach question. And the question that keeps coming up for me is sort of the divide between approaches that actually have something that we would call morphophonology and approaches that just generalize suppletion as much as they can, going back to a point on which I think Hagit and I agree a lot, which is you don't want to do that, right? So you have people who would have like sing-sang as suppletion in addition to all these other things. And so I was wondering, what you thought in your own work about that division, because it comes up in very interesting ways, starting with the Majaro 1996 paper, where he's trying, he has like a difference between ends that are created by changes and ends that are actually underlying ends or else or whatever. And I was wondering more recently if you've been thinking about, morphophonology versus suppletion in that general kind of way.
When you say suppletion, you mean you're talking about allomorphy. So exactly what
two distinct
morphophonology, because people have been using suppletion with different meanings. So
for stems, I mean, like it would be having sing and sang and sung as realizations of different vocabulary items. For affixes, it would be like saying, that you had one allomorph of plural that's en, like an oxen, and another that is za, and they're just different objects, rather than say
you mean so in the case of okay, so let me see if I understand what you mean. So in like the plural case, the oxen and the regular z, so you're meaning whether we are saying that they are like different vocabulary items in competition? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, because
as opposed to like in the case of the phonologically conditioned one, to just have one vocabulary item, and you send and there's no issue of competition whatsoever. Is it?
Yeah, because there's a tendency, I think, for people to want to do away with the part of phonology that is sensitive to the morphology. And people do this by generalizing suppletion, for stems especially, where they would say there's all these suppletive stems in memory, and it's a possible analysis, but it's not proven to be the case. I agree with Hagit on a lot of these points. But people also do this for affixes. So if you have, an affix that triggers a morphophonological change, meaning not across the board in the language, what does that mean for its representation, right? I mean, I'm happy with the idea that there are phonological processes that are, triggered, targeted by specific morphemes.
Oh, you mean, so like readjustment rules, you mean?
Yeah, anything. I call it morphophonology because that's more palatable.
But readjustment type rules.
Yeah.
You mean? Yeah, I'm not too happy with them. Also because sometimes you get like several changes and then it becomes a mess. I mean, usually the cases that are discussed, like the sing-sang cases, it just one vowel that is alternating. But I think, one can think of, not right now, but I'm sure there are cases, more complex cases, where you get like different types of changes at the same time. And then I don't know how you would do it with readjustment rules. I don't know. I haven't given much of a thought about it, but I'm not very good friends.
I want to actually second that because I think that allomorphy exists and stem suppletion. I mean, it's not that you can't state it. I just think it's exotic, to put it mildly. So I wonder, for instance, where is the boundary? Take catch, caught in English. It's there's quite a bit that's different. I mean, you've lost the whole second consonant in catch, but you still think it's an allomorphy. So it's tricky to decide where to put the line.
Yes.
What's sufficient phonological faithfulness for us to think that? I mean, sing-sang, I agree, and if I'm talking about, let's say, an augmented root, then this in English would just be SNG, and then the vowel would come further up, and it wouldn't be a problem. But for catch caught, it's a bit more of a problem because I have a whole other consonant that has to come from somewhere.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good example, actually. Yeah, that kind of case. Yeah.
We have two more questions from the audience. We don't have more time, but we can have some time if we want to. So we could stick around a little bit to answer those two questions. Those are for Dave. So
yeah, I'll say something quickly because they're both pretty specific, which is for Omer. The examples with these biphrases, I think the state relevant part is the example I was using just to show that they're sometimes really, really easy to get was something like, you know, imagine an exercise where you're supposed to sneak up on the observer, and it's easy then to say something like, the goal of this exercise is to remain unobserved or unspotted by the observer for as long as possible. Okay, and I think the idea there is that, you know, the state of having been spotted by someone is what is relevant. Okay, it matters that you were spotted by someone. That's a type of state relevance that is for what I think is the resultant state reading. And so it's just going to be the fact that, you know, someone was involved with that is what matters for it. I've tried to get biphrases into target state contexts as well, and that's a little more difficult, but I would be happy to talk to you about it at some point. For the second question, that's a good one. So my assumption is that the N and let's say the XN compound like beer truck, it is phase defining, but nothing causes it to be interpreted because, you know, basically I'm adjoining one root N to another root N. And so they're interpreted when the next thing that makes them get spelled out is merged, and that would allow the head to see the modifier and the modifier to see the head. And you need that because the XN compounds can be opaque in either the modifier or head position or both. So you have strawberry that is opaque, transparent. You have jailbird that is transparent, opaque. And you have bellhop that is opaque, opaque, or ladybird that is opaque, opaque. And so I think you want the heads to see each other for interpretation, and that would follow if that way of putting things together does not trigger their closing off spell out. Thanks.
So I had one last general question, which I am not going to miss this opportunity to make, but it could have a long answer, but I will ask you to answer it, all of you or some of you. But I was wondering if how the performance data from processing and acquisition could help us to look at those theoretical notions, paradigms, root, what's the root, the interactions of objects, because sometimes different theories are looking at the same object and proposing different notions, like paradigm, like we just saw the notion of the suppletion and allomorphy. So as you are theoreticians which are proposing those theoretical notions, how could we look at performance data? And maybe this is a theme for the next panel, but I would like you to briefly comment on that.
Okay, I can maybe start. On acquisition, I did do some work way back when on the basis, not on the basis of experiments, on the basis of longitudinal data on what children do with the keys. And there's also a lot of work that especially Ruth Berman and her collaborators have done on this. And the results are pretty much what I told you. There are a number of claims in the literature which I concluded are not really correct. So there was a claim in the literature, for instance, that children use one root, one key combinations and nothing else, and that actually turned out not to be correct. There was a claim in the literature that the children tend to statistically normalize. So the keys do have some statistical correlation with meaning that, you know, we still don't know what to do with exactly, but the children tend to regularize in that direction. There are also situations where you know that the children are aiming towards a verb with a particular meaning, as far as we can tell. Sometimes you don't know what the children mean, so you know that's kind of their biggest mistakes we can't analyze because we haven't the faintest idea what they're trying to say. So I kind of gave you that. Relative to processing, there's an endless list of studies of the processing of roots and keys of Binyanim. The latest series that I'm particularly aware of is Adam Musishkin, who's done a lot of experiments on Maltese, which is a particularly interesting system in terms of the key root situation. And I mean, I can't summarize his results, but all I can say is sort of that's the punchline, because Adam started his career in the firm belief that there are no roots, and his experimental results convinced him otherwise. But there has been shown sensitivity in processing both to root types and to key types, and so both of these serve as effective triggers, for instance, in attention and retrieval things, and so. There are good reasons to think that they are both present. I mean, it's also, there are other factors. The keys are not evenly distributed. So if you look at a language like Hebrew, 40% of the vocabulary is in Kal, of the verb vocabulary is in Kal, and 7% are in the second template, and the rest are somewhere between 70 and 30 or something like that. Just divide the 7 and 30. So what you get in children is the children veer away from the ones that are less out there, and whether that's means that it's disappearing, I don't actually think it's disappearing, but it's not as salient, and so it takes more time. Yeah, okay, that's what I know. Yeah.
I guess I would add that I think experimental data is crucial to understanding the, you know, suppletion versus not boundary. If I'm correct in some things that I've said in other places, morphophonology and suppletive allomorphy might sometimes have very similar or identical locality conditions. So you could not tell just by looking at the languages that we have what phenomenon you have, which will lead to people making conceptual arguments or just, you know, asserting that it's one way or the other, whereas through behavioral and neural experimentation, you can distinguish effects due to different types of identity, you know, in principle, abstract morphological identity versus that plus phonological identity, that plus phonological overlap. And so the goal would be to use those tools. The issue is that because of the nature of suppletion, it's hard to set up experiments because there are not many suppletive suppletive which is part of the point, I think.
And also, you have to compare it to just synonyms. The question is, where do the suppletion stop and synonyms start? It's not easy to determine. Yeah,
that's a very difficult question to answer. No.
The easier place to start is with the sing-sang type, and you know, trying to see if they show the kinds of identity relations that you would not expect from, like, say, go, went. But again, you're really limited in the number of items that you're dealing with, and they're from different parts of the vocabulary, and that makes things complex.
Another thing that I don't know, I sometimes think about, it's not quite about processing or anything, well, yeah, a little bit, is like with, I was mentioning paradigms, is whether like the types of phenomena I was mentioning, the last one is, as some people have said, well, you know, this is a historical thing. And there's no explanation other than, you know, a historical one.
Yes.
So that's one of those questions that I don't know what kind of experiments one could do to tell, you know.
But I think it is a historical thing, that's for sure. I mean, the question is, especially if you're beginning to look at children, it's of no significance. The historical origin of go and went, for instance, is simply not. It's not helpful, you know, to the speaker. It's. So I mean, that's the problem, I think. I mean, I don't know, it's like preaching to the converted, but historical accounts very much assume that a language is a thing out there. So yeah, not that it's a thing in here. And if it's a thing in here, the history is just, it's irrelevant.
Okay, so I think we are going to end now. Before that, I'd like to once more thanks all of you for the amazing talks. I also thanks the audience and the Morphology Committee, Professor Ana Paula Scher and Ieda Alves once more. And I'll ask the audience to stay tuned to the next Abralin ao Vivo events. And I hope we can see you in Brazil in the near future.
Yes, I hope so too.
Nice.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you and bye. That was
Bye.
great. Awesome. Bye-bye.
Bye.